Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to an era that gets romanticized endlessly in movies, fantasy novels, and Renaissance fairs where people eat turkey legs and pretend everything smells like cinnamon. Tonight, we are pulling back that beautifully embroidered curtain and looking at what medieval life actually felt like from the inside. And I will tell you right now, it is not pretty. It is cold, it is damp, it is itchy in ways you do not want to think about too hard before bed. And there is a very real chance that a normal Tuesday morning in the year 1200 would absolutely break you. You probably would not survive your first week, if we are being entirely honest about this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing that someone in New Zealand is drifting off to this while someone in Canada is just getting into bed and someone in the UK is probably listening at a deeply questionable hour on a Tuesday. You are all welcome here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are going to begin tonight not in a castle, not in a monastery with candlelight flickering across illuminated manuscripts, and certainly not in anything resembling comfort. You are going to begin exactly where most medieval people began every single day of their lives, in the dark, in the cold, in a bed that is not really a bed, pressed up against at least two other human beings who have not bathed recently, listening to a sound that your brain will take several groggy seconds to identify. That sound is a rooster, or possibly a pig, or possibly your neighbor, who sounds disturbingly like both. It is somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning. The sky outside is the particular shade of dark gray that does not promise dawn so much as it merely threatens it. There is no alarm clock. There is no snooze button. There is no option to lie in for another 20 minutes while you scroll through your phone. There is only the creeping awareness of the cold, which is not the mild inconvenience of a chilly room. This is medieval cold, the kind that has been accumulating in the walls of your home since October and has absolutely no plans to leave until April, if you are lucky, if the season cooperates, which, historically speaking, it frequently did not. You swing your legs off the straw pallet, because calling it a mattress would be generous, and your feet make contact with a packed earth floor that registers somewhere between unpleasant and medically concerning in terms of temperature. You are wearing most of what you own. This was not a choice born of eccentricity. This was thermal strategy. The single rough woolen blanket you share with your family members was never going to be enough on its own. So you slept in your day clothes, your night clothes if you had them, and whatever additional layer you could pile on top without suffocating yourself. Even so, you are cold. You are always cold. Cold is not a condition in medieval life. It is a permanent companion, like a very unhelpful friend who follows you everywhere and contributes nothing. The fire, and there is a fire, because without a fire you would not have survived the night, particularly in the northern latitudes of England, France, the Germanic territories, or Scandinavia, has burned down to embers. Someone has to tend to it. If you are the youngest adult in the household, that someone is you. You crouch by the hearth, which is not a fireplace in the chimney with mantelpiece sense you might be imagining. In most ordinary homes of this period, the fire burns on a central hearth on the floor, and the smoke drifts upward toward a hole in the roof. This arrangement works, after a fashion, in the way that many medieval solutions work. It solves the immediate problem while introducing several new and more interesting ones. We will get to those later. For now, you are blowing on the embers, coaxing them back to life, and the smoke is going mostly up but also somewhat sideways, and your eyes are already watering, and this is simply how mornings begin. Historians still argue whether the majority of medieval peasants actually experienced chronic sleep deprivation as a structural feature of their lives, or whether the segmented sleep pattern documented in various sources, sleeping in 2 distinct shifts with a wakeful period in the middle of the night, actually made their relationship with rest fundamentally different from ours. The historian Roger Kirch made a compelling case that pre-industrial sleep was naturally divided into first sleep and second sleep, with people waking around midnight for an hour or two of quiet activity, prayer, reflection, conversation, or occasionally visiting neighbors, which says something rather wonderful about medieval social life. Whether this two-phase system was a universal experience or something more variable across regions, seasons, and social classes remains genuinely contested. What we know is that the modern assumption that sleep is one continuous 8-hour block is itself a relatively recent idea, and the medieval peasant might have found your sleeping habits just as strange as you find theirs. You are, for the purposes of tonight's journey, a peasant. Not a serf in the most bound sense. Not someone who literally cannot leave the land without permission, though that situation applied to many, but a free peasant, a villager, a person of modest means and heavy obligations. You exist somewhere in the broad middle band of medieval rural society, which means you are neither starving in a ditch nor sitting comfortably in a manor house. You have a small plot of land. You owe labor and goods to the lord whose land you live on. You have a family, probably several children, a few animals, and a collection of tools that represent years of careful economic management and which you would be absolutely devastated to lose. You are, by the standards of your time and place, doing reasonably okay. Hold on to that thought, because reasonably okay in the medieval context is going to require significant qualification. The house you live in is roughly rectangular, probably between 30 and 60 feet long, with wattle and daub walls, that is, a wooden framework filled in with a mixture of wet clay, straw, and other organic materials that you would rather not dwell on, and a thatched roof. The roof is the thing that most modern people underestimate. A good thatched roof is genuinely impressive architecture. It sheds water effectively, provides reasonable insulation, and can last decades if properly maintained. A bad thatched roof, or one that has been neglected through a winter or two of financial hardship, is essentially a slowly composting ceiling that drips, hosts entire ecosystems of insects and small rodents, and occasionally sheds large damp clumps onto whatever is underneath it. The good news is that you are probably used to it. The bar for acceptable housing conditions in this era was calibrated by people who had never experienced anything better, which is one of those historical facts that sounds grim until you remember that happiness is largely relative and medieval people were, by all accounts, entirely capable of it. The morning routine, and this is where the weight of the day really begins to settle onto your shoulders, is not a routine in the leisurely modern sense. There is no coffee. There is no scrolling. There is no standing in a hot shower for 8 minutes while you mentally rehearse conversations that will never happen. There is, instead, an immediate cascade of tasks that cannot wait and will not do themselves. The animals need feeding. In many households, and this is one of those details that tends to surprise people who have not thought about it, the animals are not in a separate barn. They are in the lower section of your home, separated from the living area by perhaps a low partition or simply by convention. Your cow, if you have one, is roughly 12 feet from where you sleep. Your pigs are closer than you would like. Your chickens have negotiated free range of the entire interior in a way that suggests they were involved in drafting the lease agreement. The reason for this arrangement is not that medieval people were unaware of the concept of a separate barn, or that they lacked the initiative to build one. The reason is heat. Animals generate warmth. In the depths of a northern European winter, having large warm-bodied animals sharing your living space raised the ambient temperature of the whole structure by a meaningful amount, and in an era when the difference between uncomfortable cold and life-threatening cold was measured in degrees, you made pragmatic choices. You tolerated the smell. You tolerated the noise. You tolerated the particular experience of waking up to find a chicken standing on your feet with the absolute confidence of something that believes itself to be in charge. Because the alternative, letting the animals sleep outside in a structure that was not heating itself with body heat, risked losing animals that represented a significant portion of your family's entire economic security. A dead ox in February was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. There is something almost meditative about the early morning animal tending, if you allow yourself to notice it. The low sounds of the livestock, the smell of hay and warm animal bodies, the small physical rituals of feeding and checking and moving. People who have worked with animals will tell you that there is a particular kind of quiet attention that the work demands, and that this attention is, in its own way, restful, a different kind of presence than the racing thought variety. Medieval people did not have a word for mindfulness, but they had the conditions that produce it, which is perhaps the same thing wearing different clothes. By the time the fire is properly rebuilt and the animals are tended to, the sky outside has shifted from dark gray to light gray. This is what passes for dawn in November. You have already been awake for over an hour and have not yet eaten anything, which is not yet remarkable because the first meal of the day, breakfast in a very loose sense, is not typically eaten until the first break in the morning's labor, sometime around what we would call mid-morning. Your stomach knows this. It has made its peace with it the way medieval stomachs made their peace with many things, which is to say through a combination of adaptation and the simple absence of alternatives. You step outside. The village is already stirring. Your neighbors, a family of perhaps 5 or 6 people living in a structure similar to yours, at a distance that would make any modern urban planner wince with joy because it is genuinely close to optimal density for a pre-industrial agricultural community, are moving through their own morning tasks. There is a particular quality to the light at this hour in early winter, a kind of pewter luminescence that makes everything look like an illustration from a manuscript. The bare trees at the edge of the common field. The rutted path between houses, half frozen into ridges that will be ankle-turning mud by midday when the frost lifts. The church at the far end of the village, its squat stone tower darker than the sky behind it. The church, it should be noted, is the most permanent and well-constructed building in your immediate world by a considerable margin. The church is built of stone. Your house is not. The Lord's manor house may be partly stone, but even that is a humble structure compared to the confidence with which medieval ecclesiastical architecture was built. The church will outlast every living person you know by centuries. In some villages it already has. There is a specific medieval understanding of permanence that flows directly from this disparity, an awareness that the structures of faith and feudal obligation are more durable than any individual human life, which is either comforting or terrifying depending on where you stand in the hierarchy. And mostly, if you are a peasant, you stand fairly near the bottom. A quick quirky note before we go further into this morning. There is documented evidence from several medieval sources of people keeping pet weasels in their homes as a form of pest control. A predecessor to the cat, essentially, though with considerably more attitude. The idea of waking up on a freezing medieval morning to find a weasel staring at you from the top of your grain sack is the kind of detail that somehow makes the whole era feel more vivid and also more chaotic than the textbooks suggest. The labor that awaits you on this particular morning depends on the season. Let's say it is late autumn, the plowing done, the harvest long in. Your work today involves hauling wood, mending a section of fence that has been damaged, possibly some threshing if there is grain still to separate, and the perpetual background maintenance of a life built entirely on physical infrastructure that is always slowly falling apart. The wooden handle of your primary tool, a hoe, a spade, depending on the task, is smooth with years of use and slightly too short for your height, because it was made by someone working from a general template rather than your specific measurements, and adjusting tools for individual ergonomic comfort was not really a medieval priority. Your hands are already rough. They have been rough since you were old enough to hold things. By the end of a working day, they will be raw and cold and stiff, and you will warm them by the fire in the evening with the particular grateful relief of someone who understands warmth as a gift rather than a given. The weight of waking in medieval life is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fanfare or tragedy. It is simply the steady, accumulating press of a world that requires constant physical effort just to maintain its current state. Not to improve, not to advance, simply to stay even. The animals alive, the fire burning, the house intact, the family fed. This is the baseline from which every medieval day launches itself, before the larger forces of weather and disease and political instability and all the other things we will get to have had their say. For now, though, the morning is cold and gray and somehow, in its own rough way, beautiful. The frost on the grass, the sound of the village waking, the smell of wood smoke beginning to rise from the rooftops. You breathe it in. You square your shoulders. You pick up your tools. You have a very long day ahead of you. The first meal of the day arrives sometime around mid-morning, and if you have been working since before dawn, which you have, because you are a medieval peasant and the concept of easing gently into the day is a luxury so remote it might as well be a fairy tale, then you are hungry in the specific, focused way that only genuine physical labor produces. This is not the mild, negotiable hunger of someone who skipped a snack. This is the bone-deep, slightly lightheaded insistence of a body that has been burning calories in the cold for 3 hours and would very much like some input on the matter. What you are about to eat is pottage. It was pottage yesterday. It will be pottage tomorrow. It has been pottage with minor seasonal variations for most of your living memory, and it will continue to be pottage until something either improves your circumstances dramatically or ends them entirely. Pottage is, at its most basic, a thick porridge or stew made from whatever grains, legumes, and vegetables are available, boiled together in a pot with water and, if you are fortunate, a small amount of fat or salt. On good days, it contains oats, dried peas, leeks, perhaps a turnip or a parsnip. On less good days, it is thinner, paler, and the vegetables are less a presence than a rumor. On genuinely difficult days, toward the end of winter when the stores are running low and spring is still a promise rather than a reality, the pottage is largely water with ambition. You eat it from a bowl that is either pottery, rough, local-made earthenware, or a hollowed-out round of stale bread called a trencher, which serves as both vessel and, eventually, an additional food source once it has absorbed enough of the stew to become edible. The trencher system is one of those medieval solutions that is simultaneously practical, economical, and the kind of thing that makes modern food safety inspectors wake up screaming. The bread absorbs everything. The broth, the grease, the flavors, and also whatever was on your hands, which, given the morning you have just had, is a consideration. You eat it anyway. Waste is not a concept that medieval food culture has much patience for. The bread itself deserves its own moment of attention, because bread in the medieval period was not the fluffy, even-textured, reliably edible product that the word conjures in modern minds. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and frequently made from a mixture of grains that reflected whatever the harvest had provided rather than any particular baking preference. Maslin bread, a mixture of wheat and rye, was common. In poorer households, bread might be made from rye alone, or from a mixture that included barley, oats, or even dried peas and beans ground into flour when wheat was scarce. The result was nutritionally reasonable but texturally challenging, a bread that required actual jaw effort and that, by the second day, had achieved a firmness that put it somewhere on the spectrum between food and building material. And then there was the ergot problem. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other cereals under certain conditions of damp and cold, precisely the conditions that medieval grain storage regularly provided. Ergot-contaminated grain, when ground into flour and baked into bread, produces a substance that causes ergotism, a condition whose symptoms include burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, gangrene of the extremities. Historians still argue whether the famous episodes of mass hysteria and strange convulsive behavior recorded in various medieval communities, including some events that were at the time interpreted as supernatural visitation or demonic possession, were in fact outbreaks of ergotism caused by contaminated grain supplies. The connection is plausible, the evidence is suggestive, and the image of an entire village having collective hallucinations because of their bread is the kind of detail that makes medieval history feel both more human and considerably more alarming than the textbook version. You, fortunately, are not currently experiencing ergotism. The bread this morning is merely dense and slightly sour from the fermentation process, and you eat it without complaint because complaining about food is a luxury that requires both an audience with opinions and a viable alternative, neither of which you currently have access to. The drink alongside your meal is ale, almost certainly ale. Medieval water, and this point cannot be emphasized enough, was not reliably safe to drink, particularly in any settlement of significant size where the proximity of people, animals, and waste products to water sources created conditions that would make a modern microbiologist compose an entire sad album. The solution was fermentation. Ale, brewed from malted grain and water, was a daily staple consumed by men, women, and children alike, because the fermentation process killed most of the pathogens that made the water dangerous, and because the mild caloric content was a genuine nutritional contribution to a diet that needed all the help it could get. Medieval ale was not the high-alcohol beverage of modern craft brewing culture. It was weak, around 1 to 3% alcohol, and thick with residual grain matter, more of a liquid food than a recreational drink. You were not getting drunk at breakfast. You were hydrating in the safest available format. There is something quietly fascinating about the role of the alewife in medieval village life, the woman, typically, who brewed and sold ale from her home, identifiable by the traditional symbol of a pole with a bush or bundle of greenery hung outside the door to signal that fresh ale was available. This was one of the few small-scale commercial activities that medieval women regularly conducted with relative independence, and the alewife was a figure of genuine social importance in the community, even if she was also a figure of gentle mockery in the popular literature of the period, portrayed as a cheating, watering-down schemer in a pointed hat. The image of the witch's hat, some scholars have suggested, may have derived partly from the tall conical hats that alewives wore to be visible above the market crowd. This is a genuinely fun theory that sits in the category of plausible and entertaining, though not definitively proven, which is one of the better neighborhoods in the landscape of historical speculation. Now let's talk about meat, because meat is the thing that most people, when they imagine medieval eating, place at the center of the table. The great roasted haunches, the whole pigs on spits, the boar's head ceremony. And yes, those things existed. For a lord hosting a feast, for a noble household celebrating a significant occasion, for a monastery observing a major saint's day, meat was present in abundance and variety. For you, a peasant in a village, meat was something else entirely. It was occasional, seasonal, carefully managed, and never wasted. The animals you kept were not primarily food. They were infrastructure. Your ox was your tractor. Your cow was your dairy unit. Your pigs were your waste management system and your walking salt pork reserve. You did not eat these animals casually. You ate them when they were old and no longer productive, when they were injured beyond recovery, and this was the great seasonal killing moment in November, when the onset of winter made it impossible to feed large animals through to spring, and the practical calculus of medieval livestock management said that it was better to butcher and preserve now than to watch them slowly starve and lose both the animals and the meat. November was slaughter month. The killing of pigs, in particular Martmas, around the feast of St. Martin on November 11th, was a major event in the agricultural calendar, a moment of both practical necessity and genuine communal significance. The whole animal was used, every part. The intestines cleaned and used as sausage casings. The blood mixed with grain and fat for black pudding. The fat rendered down. The head boiled for brawn. The less prestigious cuts preserved in salt, which was itself a precious commodity. The more prestigious cuts, and prestigious here is doing a lot of heavy lifting, hung to cure. Nothing was wasted because nothing could afford to be. The salt-preserved meat that resulted from this process was, by the time you were eating it in February or March, a culinary experience that required a certain philosophical flexibility. Salt preservation worked. It prevented the kind of bacterial activity that would have made the meat genuinely dangerous. But it also made the meat extraordinarily salty, sometimes almost inevitably so, and prolonged salting combined with the conditions of medieval storage produced textures and flavors that were challenging by any standard. The medieval cook solution was to soak the meat before cooking, change the water several times, and add strong flavoring agents to mask what could not be removed. Spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves were the great medieval flavor correctors, used partly for their genuine taste but also significantly to make preserved foods palatable. The popular theory that spices were used to cover the taste of rotting meat is an oversimplification that historians have pushed back against for decades, because rotten meat would have made you sick regardless of how much pepper was on it, and medieval people were not stupid. But the idea that spices were partly a corrective technology for the inevitable staleness and salt heaviness of preserved food is not entirely wrong either. Fish was the other major protein source, and its role in medieval diet was shaped fundamentally by religion. The medieval Catholic calendar required abstinence from meat on Fridays, Saturdays in some traditions, the entire 40 days of Lent, and various other fast days scattered through the year. Historians estimate that the number of meat-free days in a devout medieval calendar could approach 150 per year. This was not merely a dietary preference. It was a legal and religious obligation enforced with genuine seriousness. The result was an enormous and sophisticated trade in preserved fish, salt cod, dried herring, salted eel, that stretched from the fishing grounds of Scandinavia and the North Sea down through Europe's entire network of markets and trade routes. Herring in particular was the great democratic protein of the medieval world, available even to the poor, filling, caloric, and possessed of a smell that announced its presence with considerable confidence from some distance away. The vegetable situation in a medieval diet is both better and worse than you might expect. Better because the range of vegetables actually cultivated and eaten was wider than the limited medieval equals cabbage and turnip shorthand suggests. Onions, leeks, garlic, beans, peas, parsnips, carrots. The carrots of this period were not the bright orange variety but rather white, purple, or yellow strains that have since been largely replaced. Cabbages, kale, and various herbs were all part of the agricultural picture. Worse because the seasonality was absolute. In summer and early autumn, when vegetables were fresh and available, the diet improved considerably. In late winter, fresh vegetables were simply gone, replaced by whatever could be dried, pickled, or stored, and the resulting nutritional picture, particularly the decline in vitamin C, had real physiological consequences. Scurvy was not only a sailor's disease. It was a late winter feature of medieval life for people who had eaten their way through their stores and were waiting for spring to produce something green. Foraging supplemented the cultivated diet in ways that should not be underestimated. The hedgerows and woodlands around a medieval village were a genuine resource. Wild garlic, nettles, berries, mushrooms, nuts, and various plants that the modern food system has simply forgotten about. Nettles, in particular, were an important early spring vegetable, one of the first green things to emerge when the winter stores were at their lowest. And a nettle pottage in March was both nutritious and, in a very specific seasonal context, genuinely delicious in the way that anything becomes delicious when it arrives at exactly the moment of maximum need. Honey was the sweetener of the medieval world, sugar being a rare and expensive import available only to the wealthy. The medieval sweet tooth was not fundamentally different from the modern one. Human beings are hardwired for sweetness, and medieval people were no exception. The management of beehives was a skilled and valued activity, and honey appeared in cooking, in medicine, in mead, and in the general category of small precious things that made life slightly better in ways disproportionate to their actual caloric contribution. Finding a good wild honeybee colony was, in a very real sense, a minor windfall. There is a genuine quirky footnote to medieval food history in the form of the cockentrice, a dish, documented in several medieval recipe collections, created by splitting a pig and a capon, a castrated rooster, in half lengthwise and sewing the front half of one to the back half of the other, then roasting the result. This produced a single animal that was half pig, half bird, a Frankenstein protein that existed entirely for the theatrical delight of feastgoers and the desire of medieval chefs to demonstrate that they had both the skill and the confidence to do things simply because they could. The cockentrice belongs to the long and proud tradition of culinary showmanship that has nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with impressing people. And it is a reminder that even in an era of profound food insecurity for most people, the human appetite for creativity and spectacle found ways to express itself. You, of course, will not be eating cockentrice. You will be finishing your pottage, washing down the dense bread with the weak ale, and getting back to work. The bowl, if it is pottery rather than trencher, will be rinsed in water from the household bucket and set aside for the next meal, which will be the main meal of the day, eaten around noon when the light is best. Because cooking and eating in the available natural light is simply the practical approach when candles and rushlight are precious enough that you do not burn them unnecessarily in the middle of the day. The midday meal will be more pottage, probably, with perhaps some of that salt-preserved meat added in, or a piece of cheese made from your cow's milk, or an egg if the chickens have cooperated. It will be filling, more or less. It will keep you going through the afternoon's work. It will not be exciting, but excitement was never really on the menu. Not literally, not metaphorically. What medieval food provided when the system was working was fuel. Reliable, mostly adequate, occasionally surprising in its creativity and range, but fundamentally organized around the single priority of keeping the body operational through another day of demanding physical existence. The evening meal, eaten before dark because again, candlelight is expensive, will be lighter. More bread, more ale, maybe the leftover pottage reheated, maybe nothing more than bread and cheese and the comfortable near silence of a family too tired for extended conversation. And then, in the firelight, in the warmth that the burning wood and the animal bodies have between them managed to generate, the day begins to wind down. You are, by this point, profoundly ready for it. The smell hits you before anything else. This is one of those truths about medieval life that no painting, no manuscript illustration, no carefully researched historical drama has ever fully managed to convey, because smell does not translate across centuries. It does not survive in archives. It leaves no physical trace that archaeology can recover. But it was there, constant and layered and entirely unremarkable to the people who lived inside it, the way the smell of your own home is invisible to you until you have been away for a week and come back with fresh nostrils and a new perspective. To a time-traveling modern visitor, the olfactory experience of a medieval village would be, let us say, significant. To you, living it, it is simply the smell of the world. There is wood smoke, always, embedded in every fiber of your clothing and every surface of your home. There is the warm, grassy, slightly fermented smell of the livestock that share your living space. There is the smell of unwashed human bodies, not the sharp chemical panic sweat of modern stress, but the earthier, deeper accumulation of physical labor without regular washing. There is the smell of the midden, the household waste heap that sits outside your door, because waste disposal in the medieval period operated on the principle that everything organic would eventually decompose and that the best approach was to pile it somewhere convenient and wait. And the smell of the street, which is essentially the midden spread laterally across a larger surface area. There is the smell of tallow candles when they are burning, which is an animal fat smell, rich and slightly rancid. There is, underneath all of it, the smell of the earth itself, the cold damp soil that is the floor of your home and the substance of everything around you. You do not notice any of this. You have never noticed it. It is the smell of being alive in the world you inhabit, and your nose has long since made its peace with it. But let us talk about the body itself and the question of cleanliness, because this is an area where the popular historical imagination has gone dramatically wrong in two completely opposite directions at different points in history. And the truth is, as it so often is, considerably more interesting and complicated than either extreme. The Victorian era, which was deeply invested in the idea of historical progress culminating in its own superior civilization, produced the image of medieval people as uniformly filthy, never bathing, wallowing cheerfully in their own accumulation. This image survived into the 20th century and still shapes the way most people instinctively picture medieval hygiene. Unwashed, unbothered, essentially pre-cleanliness. The revisionist response to this, which gathered momentum particularly from the 1980s onward, went in the opposite direction, producing articles and social media posts with titles along the lines of "Medieval people actually bathed all the time," and "The Middle Ages were cleaner than you think," which overcorrected into a kind of defensive cheerfulness that also does not quite capture reality. The actual picture sits between these poles and is shaped by a set of factors that have nothing to do with whether medieval people valued cleanliness. They did, clearly and consistently across every social level, and everything to do with the practical constraints of accessing water, heating it, and integrating washing into a life organized around relentless physical labor and limited resources. Water first. Your home does not have running water. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a structural feature of your entire relationship with cleanliness. Water must be fetched, typically by women and older children, from the nearest well, stream, or communal water source, carried in wooden buckets or clay vessels, and brought home. This takes time and physical effort every single day, just for the water needed for cooking and drinking. Water for washing, the quantities required for a full bath, represents a significant additional labor investment, and heating that water over the fire adds another layer of time and fuel expenditure. A full bath, in the modern sense, was simply not a casual daily activity for someone in your circumstances. It was a considered undertaking. What this meant in practice was a layered approach to bodily hygiene that was more sophisticated than never wash and less elaborate than daily shower. The face and hands were washed regularly because they were the parts of the body most visible, most practically implicated in food preparation and eating, and most easily cleaned with a small amount of water. There is consistent documentary evidence across medieval sources, conduct literature, household management texts, religious instructions for monastic life, of regular face and hand washing being treated as a basic expectation of civilized behavior. Washing before meals was a social norm in households of any standing. The elaborateness of the hand-washing ritual at noble tables, where scented water was brought in ewers and poured over the hands of diners by servants, was a mark of status, but the basic act it was performing was a universal expectation. The rest of the body was cleaned less frequently, and the frequency varied enormously by social class, access to resources, season, and individual inclination. Public bathhouses, stews they were called, existed in virtually every medieval town of any size, often attached to or near taverns and inns, where for a small fee you could access a tub of hot water, some soap, and a degree of social interaction that ranged from the entirely respectable to the considerably less so. The bathhouse had a complex reputation in medieval culture, oscillating between being an ordinary amenity of urban life and being associated with prostitution and moral looseness to a degree that prompted periodic attempts at regulation or closure. Historians still argue whether the closure of many urban bathhouses in the later medieval period, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, was primarily driven by moral concerns, by fears about disease transmission during plague outbreaks, or by some combination of the two. Whatever the reason, the urban bathhouse was a genuine institution of medieval civic life for several centuries before its reputation became too complicated to sustain. You, in your village, do not have access to a professional bathhouse. Your bathing, when it happens in any more comprehensive sense than the daily face and hands routine, takes place in a wooden tub in your home, with water heated over the fire, with multiple family members sharing the same water in sequence because heating enough water for individual baths would be an unreasonable luxury. The sequence in which family members bathed was typically hierarchical, head of household first, then down through the family, which produced a memorable piece of folk etymology when people claimed this was the origin of the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." The logic being that by the time the baby had its turn, the water was murky enough that a small child could theoretically be lost in it. Whether this etymology is actually true is a matter some linguists find dubious, but it has survived with the cheerful tenacity of a good story that refuses to let factual uncertainty slow it down. Soap existed. This is important to establish because the popular image of medieval people scrubbing themselves with handfuls of sand or giving up entirely elides the fact that soap was a real, manufactured, traded product in the medieval world. Soap making was a recognized craft. The product was made from a combination of animal fat or vegetable oil and wood ash lye, and it ranged in quality from the rough, harsh home-produced variety to the imported luxury soaps of Castile and Venice. Castile soap, made from olive oil, was the prestige product, traded across Europe and considered superior to the greasier, smellier domestic alternatives. Even the basic soap available to ordinary people was functional, if not pleasant in the way that modern glycerin-enriched, lavender-scented soap is pleasant. Cleaned. It is more than some people imagine. Hair was washed, combed, and managed with considerably more attention and regularity than the popular image suggests. For women, hair was often washed with a mixture of water, wood ash, and herbs, rosemary, lavender, and various other plants with pleasant smells and mild antiseptic properties were regularly recommended in the household and medical texts of the period. Combing was important not only for appearance but for the management of lice, which brings us to the creatures. The lice situation in medieval life was, let's be honest with ourselves, significant. Head lice, body lice, the latter living in clothing rather than directly on the body, and fleas were the constant companions of medieval existence at virtually every social level. Archaeological excavations of medieval sites consistently find evidence of these parasites in preserved organic material, in combs, in clothing remnants, in the remains of mattress stuffing. Fine-toothed combs designed specifically for removing lice and their eggs, nits, from hair have been found in medieval contexts from England to Egypt, and they are found in wealthy households as well as poor ones, which tells you something important about the essentially democratic distribution of certain medieval inconveniences. Your lice do not care how many acres you own. The flea situation was inseparable from the animal-in-the-house arrangement that we discussed this morning. Where there are animals, there are fleas. Medieval households had both in abundance. The attempts to manage flea populations through herbs, pennyroyal, tansy, and other strongly scented plants were strewn on floors and used in bedding partly for this purpose, had some efficacy but were not by any means a complete solution. The medieval bed was a particular point of concentration for various unwanted guests. The straw or dried plant material in mattresses was a congenial environment for a variety of insects, and the shared, enclosed sleeping space of a medieval household created conditions that no amount of herb strewing was going to fully address. Here is the quirky footnote. There is a medieval herbal remedy for flea infestations that recommends placing a piece of bread soaked in blood beside the bed, on the logic that the fleas would be attracted to it and you could then remove them all at once. Whether this actually worked is, to put it gently, questionable. But it does illustrate a consistent feature of medieval practical problem solving. The willingness to try something, anything, based on a theory that had at least an internal logic, even when that logic was operating without any supporting understanding of the actual biology involved. The teeth deserve attention, because dental health is one of the most archaeologically legible aspects of medieval physical life. Medieval skeletons are informative documents. The teeth tell stories, and the story they tell is mixed in interesting ways. On one hand, the medieval diet, low in refined sugar, high in fibrous vegetables and coarse grains, was not as catastrophic for dental health as the sugar-saturated modern diet. Medieval populations show less decay on average than many periods that followed, particularly in the centuries after sugar became widely affordable. On the other hand, the gritty nature of medieval flour, stone-milled grain retained particles of millstone grit, and this worked its way into the bread, produced significant wear on tooth surfaces, the kind of wear that by middle age left many people with substantially abraded teeth that were vulnerable in different ways than sugar-induced decay. Tooth pain was a feature of medieval life that required management. The management was not good. Tooth extraction, performed by barbers, smiths, or traveling tooth pullers at markets and fairs, without anesthetic, with instruments that were functional rather than gentle, was the primary solution when a tooth became too problematic to ignore. The gap it left was simply where your tooth used to be. Medieval dental prosthetics existed at the luxury end. There are examples of false teeth made from bone and ivory for wealthy clients, but for ordinary people, the answer to tooth loss was chewing on the other side and adjusting your diet toward softer foods as you aged. Breath. Let's not spend long here, but it would be dishonest to skip it. Medieval medical texts show a genuine awareness of bad breath as a social and medical concern, and they offer various remedies. Chewing on spices, using preparations made from herbs, scraping the tongue. The concern was real. The solutions were variable in their effectiveness. The underlying causes, rotting teeth, gum disease, a diet heavy in preserved fish and alliums, were not going anywhere. Medieval social proximity, particularly in the shared bed and communal eating arrangements of village life, meant that other people's breath was not something you could easily avoid. The medieval nose was, in certain specific ways, significantly more philosophical than its modern counterpart. Your skin, over the course of a medieval life, would tell its own stories. Hands roughened beyond the capacity of any moisturizer to address, had moisturizer existed. Faces weathered by outdoor labor in all seasons to a texture that had nothing in common with the smooth, planed surfaces of indoor modern life. Calluses on feet that had walked on rough ground in inadequate footwear since childhood. Various scars from the small daily injuries of agricultural work. Blades, splinters, rough edges, animal hooves, the general category of things that cut and bruise and tear. The body you inhabit in this medieval life is a working body, a used body, a body that shows its history in its surface in a way that a modern body protected by shoes and gloves and moisturizer and the general softness of a non-agricultural life simply does not. And yet, there is evidence, consistent, widespread, charming in its humanity, that medieval people cared about their appearance, that they took pleasure in looking nice when circumstances allowed, that they braided their hair and wore their better clothes on feast days and admired each other and experienced attraction and vanity and the particular private satisfaction of having done something about how you looked, even in a world where the constraints on doing so were considerable. The illuminated manuscripts are full of people who look, within the conventions of medieval artistic representation, put together, neat, intentional, present in their appearance in a way that speaks to a human instinct for self-presentation that 500 years of technological change has not fundamentally altered. You are, at the end of a working day, tired and dirty and smelling of the work you have done and the life you live. You wash your hands and face at the water vessel by the door before you eat. You comb your hair in the firelight. You are, within the constraints of your world and your resources, doing your best. You have always been doing your best. That is one of the most consistent things that the evidence of medieval life shows us, across every category and every social level. People doing their best with what they had, in the world they inhabited, according to the values and understandings available to them. The best, in medieval Europe, required more effort and produced fewer comforts than most of us would be willing to tolerate. But it was a recognizable best, a human best. and that, in its own strange way, is oddly reassuring to carry with you into the evening. You are standing in the doorway of your home, that threshold between the cold outside and the marginally less cold inside, and you are looking at the structure that shelters your family with the particular evaluative eye of someone who knows, from long experience, exactly which parts of it are problems waiting to happen. The section of wall near the north corner where the daub has cracked and been repacked 3 times already. The patch of thatch above the sleeping area that needs attention before the next heavy rain. The door itself, which hangs slightly wrong on its leather hinges and lets in a draft that no amount of stuffing rags into the gap has fully defeated. You know this building the way you know a difficult relative. Its habits, its weaknesses, its tendency to create new problems just when you have addressed the old ones. Medieval housing, for the majority of the population, was not a fixed and permanent thing. It was an ongoing negotiation between human need and material reality, and material reality had significant advantages in this negotiation. The romanticized image of the medieval cottage, the picturesque, rose-climbing, honey-stoned English village house of calendar photographs and heritage tourism, belongs almost entirely to the late medieval period and afterward, and even then represents the more substantial end of the housing spectrum. The house you are standing in front of tonight is earlier, humbler, and considerably less photogenic. It is, however, yours, and in a world where security of tenure was never quite guaranteed, that possessive pronoun carries more weight than it might seem. Let us start with the walls. Wattle and daub construction, the technique of weaving flexible branches or rods between upright wooden posts to create a lattice, then packing this lattice with a mixture of clay, animal dung, straw, and water, was the dominant building method for ordinary houses across most of medieval Europe. It was not unintelligent. The materials were locally available, the technique was learnable without specialized training, and the result, when freshly made, provided reasonable protection against wind and rain. When freshly made. The challenge was that wattle and daub was not a set-and-forget building technology. It required maintenance. The daub cracked as it dried and as temperatures cycled between wet and dry, hot and cold. Cracks admitted moisture, which rotted the underlying wattle, which weakened the structural integrity of the wall. A house that was properly maintained by a household with the time and resources to do so could stand for generations. A house under pressure, and medieval households were frequently under pressure, could deteriorate with dispiriting speed. The roof situation was similarly dynamic. Thatch, the layered bundles of dried straw, reed, or heather that covered most ordinary medieval buildings, is actually excellent roofing material in the hands of a skilled thatcher who maintains it properly. A well-laid reed thatch can last 30 years. It is an effective insulator. It sheds rain efficiently when the pitch is correct. But thatch is also organic, which means it is subject to decay, and it is also extremely flammable, which is the feature that gave medieval urban planners and fire wardens their most consistent professional anxiety. Fire was the great domestic terror of medieval life. It was also, paradoxically, the source of virtually all heat and most light in the medieval home, which meant you could not live without it and could not fully be safe from it. The open central hearth, that ground-level fire we established this morning, burning without a chimney, venting imperfectly through a hole in the roof, was the principal fire risk in every ordinary home. Sparks traveled, thatch caught. And because medieval buildings were clustered close together in villages and towns, a single house fire was rarely a single house fire for long. The evidence from medieval town records, coroners' reports, and chronicle sources is full of accounts of fires that consumed dozens or hundreds of buildings before they could be controlled. London burned so regularly that the phrase has almost become a historical cliché. Exeter burned. Winchester burned. Virtually every significant medieval English town experienced at least one catastrophic fire, and the smaller settlements left less documentary evidence but certainly no fewer embers. The transition to chimneyed fireplaces, to fires built against a wall with a proper flue to carry smoke upward and out of the building, happened gradually over the medieval period, with the technology spreading unevenly from wealthier households downward. The chimney was, in terms of domestic quality of life, a genuinely transformative technology. It removed the smoke from the living space, reduced the constant eye irritation and respiratory stress of the open hearth, and placed the fire in a configuration that was somewhat easier to control and less likely to throw sparks onto the sleeping area. Historians still argue about the precise timeline and geography of chimney adoption among ordinary households. The evidence is patchy, varying considerably by region and period, but the broad picture is of a technology that improved domestic life significantly and spread through the social hierarchy over the course of several centuries. Until that transition, you are living with smoke. Let us be specific about what this means, because a bit smoky does not capture it. An open central hearth in a small enclosed building produces smoke at a volume and persistence that modern experience has no real equivalent for. The smoke rises and spreads and fills the upper portion of the room before finding the roof hole, and the lower portion of the room, where the humans are, is not smoke-free, it is merely less immediately choking. On cold days, when the roof hole is partially covered to retain heat, the smoke situation becomes genuinely uncomfortable. In winter, when the fire burns continuously and ventilation is reduced, the interior of a medieval house with an open hearth was characterized by a level of particulate matter and carbon monoxide that would fail every modern air quality standard with room to spare. The respiratory consequences were real. Studies of medieval skeletal remains have found evidence of significant sinus and respiratory stress consistent with chronic smoke inhalation. Eye irritation was a constant. The blackening of the rafters and roof interior, the accumulated soot of years of open-fire living, was universal, and this blackened thatch was itself a slight fire hazard, since sufficiently soot-saturated organic material has its own relationship with combustion that is less straightforward than fresh dry thatch. The medieval home breathed smoke the way it breathed everything else. Continuously, reluctantly, without alternative. The floor underfoot is packed earth. In the best-maintained households, this earth floor was treated with a degree of care. Swept regularly, sometimes treated with water or other substances to reduce dust, and covered with rushes or straw that were changed periodically. Floor rushes are another of those medieval domestic details that sit at the intersection of practical and questionable. Fresh rushes, particularly sweet-smelling varieties like sweet flag, which was highly prized, provided a soft, insulating, pleasantly aromatic covering that improved the experience of the earth floor considerably. Used rushes, which absorbed everything that fell, spilled, or was tracked in over the weeks between changes, were significantly less pleasant. Erasmus, the Renaissance humanist, visiting England in the early 16th century, wrote a memorably horrified description of English floor rushes that had accumulated layers of organic material over many months. Old food, animal waste, spilled ale, and other contributions from the full range of household activity, to a depth that concealed, he suggested, ancient and unspeakable things. Whether Erasmus was observing genuinely appalling conditions or applying the fastidious standards of a well-traveled cosmopolitan to ordinary domestic circumstances is a question worth keeping in mind, but his account has achieved a kind of canonical status in discussions of medieval domestic hygiene that it probably deserves, if only partially. The furniture inside a medieval peasant home was minimal by any standard and would strike the modern eye as almost aggressively sparse. A table that was often literally a board placed across trestles, dismantled and stored when not in use because the space was needed. Benches rather than chairs, chairs were a status item, the word chairman preserving the memory of the fact that having a chair, a back seat with armrests, was a mark of authority and standing rather than a default domestic provision. A chest or two for storage, which served double duty as seating and, in households without dedicated sleeping platforms, potentially as beds. The sleeping arrangements concentrated multiple family members in the smallest practical space, using shared body heat as a thermal resource, with whatever bedding the household could assemble layered on top. The concept of privacy as we understand it, the expectation of individual space, individual quiet, individual freedom from the physical and acoustic presence of other people, simply did not apply to medieval domestic life at any level below the very wealthy, and even there it was considerably more limited than we might imagine. You ate together, slept together, worked in close proximity, heard each other's conversations and disputes and illness and intimate moments with no meaningful acoustic separation. The single-room or effectively single-room domestic arrangement of most medieval peasant housing meant that life was conducted in a perpetual, unavoidable communality. This had social consequences that worked in both directions. a degree of mutual awareness and support that the modern isolated household often lacks, alongside a complete absence of the restorative solitude that many people find essential to psychological well-being. Whether medieval people experienced the lack of privacy as deprivation is genuinely difficult to assess, since they had no contrasting experience of private space to measure the absence against. But the human need for occasional quiet and aloneness did not disappear simply because the architecture made no provision for it. Windows, to the extent that they existed in ordinary homes, were small openings covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or occasionally horns scraped thin enough to transmit some light. Glass was expensive and was not a feature of ordinary domestic buildings until well into the later medieval period, and even then only in more prosperous households. The trade-off that windows represented, light versus cold, fresh air versus wind, was managed conservatively, with small openings that could be quickly shuttered when the weather required it. The interior of a medieval home was consequently dim even in the middle of the day, the available light supplemented by the glow of the fire and, when necessary, by tallow candles or rush lights, rushes soaked in animal fat that burned with a small, smelly, not particularly effective flame that was nevertheless better than nothing and considerably cheaper than proper candles. Artificial light was managed with a frugality that would seem extreme by modern standards. You did not leave lights burning in empty spaces. You did not illuminate rooms you were not using. The evening was organized around the fire and one or two small light sources, and the working assumption was that darkness meant rest, which had the incidental effect of synchronizing human activity with the natural light cycle in a way that the artificial illumination of modern life has fundamentally disrupted. Medieval people went to bed earlier and got up earlier than most modern people, not because of some virtuous discipline but because the practical costs of staying up late were real and the benefits limited. The shared walls and close proximity of village housing meant that your neighbor's building problems were also, potentially, your problems. A house fire starting next door was a direct threat to your house. A neighbor's wall that was leaning toward your property was not merely their aesthetic concern. The communal interdependence of medieval village life, which we tend to romanticize as a kind of organic social warmth, and which genuinely was that, at its best, also meant that other people's structural failures and domestic misfortunes had a way of becoming yours. Here is the genuinely quirky detail of medieval domestic architecture that tends to delight people when they encounter it. Some medieval houses were built with a small opening at the base of one wall, a leper's squint in popular parlance. Though this name is almost certainly fanciful, that may have served as a cat door, a ventilation gap, or simply a structural oddity. But more interestingly, there is evidence from various medieval sources of deliberate concealment of objects within the fabric of buildings during construction or renovation. Shoes, often children's shoes, tucked into wall cavities or beneath floorboards. Cats, occasionally either dried or mummified. Written texts or charms. The purpose of these deposits is interpreted by historians and archaeologists as protective or apotropaic objects placed within the structure of a building to ward off evil, bring good fortune, or protect the household from malevolent forces. The practice was apparently widespread and persistent, continuing well beyond the medieval period, and the discovery of these concealed objects in old buildings during renovation work is a minor but regular feature of architectural archaeology. The shoe, particularly, appears with enough frequency that it has its own scholarly literature. It speaks to something important about how medieval people understood their homes, not merely as physical structures providing shelter from weather and cold, but as spaces that had their own relationship with fortune and misfortune, spaces that required protection and attention beyond the purely mechanical. The house was, in a sense, a participant in the life of the family. It needed to be kept right, not only structurally but in ways that exceeded the structural. The household spirits of older traditions, the saints' images and holy water and blessed objects of Christian practice, and the concealed shoes and charm texts of the more quietly syncretic folk religion that ran beneath official Christianity. These were all aspects of a relationship with the domestic space that understood the home as something more than a weatherproof box. You look at your house in the fading afternoon light, and you see all of this at once without articulating any of it. You see the work it needs. You see the warmth it holds. You see the accumulated years of your family's presence in its walls. the repairs and the patches and the small additions that mark time in a way that no calendar does. You see the smoke beginning to rise more thickly from the roof hole as whoever is inside builds up the fire for the evening. You see the neighbor's goat has gotten into your vegetable patch again, which is a problem for the next 5 minutes rather than the next 5 centuries. You deal with the goat. You go inside. The door hangs slightly wrong on its hinges, and the draft comes in at the corner where it always does, and the fire is warm, and the smoke makes your eyes water, and the animals shift in their half of the building with the comfortable restlessness of large warm bodies settling for the evening. Home, in every sense that word actually means. Somewhere in your village there is a person who is considered, by general community consensus, to know something about healing. They may be the local herbalist, a woman of middling age who has accumulated decades of practical knowledge about which plants do what to which symptoms under which conditions. They may be the village priest, who has access to the ecclesiastical medical tradition filtered through whatever training he received and whatever texts he has encountered. They may simply be the oldest person in the community, whose survival to an advanced age is itself taken as evidence of some useful relationship with the forces that govern health and illness. Whatever their specific identity, they are the person you go to when your body stops cooperating, and the help they offer you is a mixture of genuine efficacy, spectacular error, and everything in between. Medieval medicine is one of those historical subjects that invites a particular kind of condescension from the modern vantage point, the comfortable superiority of people who know about germ theory and antibiotics looking back at people who did not and finding them, from this distance, almost comically misguided. This is a failure of historical imagination rather than a triumph of modern knowledge. The people who practiced and received medieval medicine were not stupid. They were operating within an intellectual framework that had its own internal logic, its own accumulated evidence, its own sophisticated theoretical structure. The fact that this framework was wrong in its foundational assumptions does not make the people within it foolish. It makes them human, doing what human beings always do, which is building the best possible explanatory system from the available evidence and then using that system to navigate a difficult world. The foundational framework was the theory of the 4 humors, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and transmitted through Arabic scholarship into the medieval European tradition with additions, modifications, and the kind of elaborate theoretical superstructure that centuries of learned commentary tends to produce. The humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, were understood as the fundamental fluids of the body, each associated with specific organs, seasons, ages, personality types, and relationships to heat and moisture. Health was balance between these humors. Disease was imbalance. Treatment was the restoration of balance, accomplished through interventions that either added to or removed the relevant humor, dietary changes, herbal remedies, bleeding, purging, sweating, or the application of substances with the appropriate humoral qualities to correct the identified excess or deficiency. This system, when applied by a knowledgeable and experienced practitioner, was not entirely without value. The dietary recommendations it generated were often sound in practice even when the theory behind them was wrong. The herbal pharmacopoeia accumulated within the humoral tradition contained a significant number of plants with genuine pharmacological activity: willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, for pain and fever; garlic, with genuine antimicrobial properties; various plants with sedative, anti-inflammatory, or digestive effects that modern pharmacology has since confirmed. The emphasis on diet, rest, and the management of environmental factors, air quality, moisture, temperature, was clinically sensible even when the theoretical justification was wrong. A medieval physician telling you to eat lightly, rest, keep warm, and drink plenty of liquid while you recovered from an illness was giving you advice that a modern doctor would not substantially improve upon for many common conditions. The problem came with the interventions that the humoral theory generated, which were not merely ineffective but actively harmful, and chief among these was bloodletting. Phlebotomy, the deliberate removal of blood from a patient through cutting a vein, typically in the arm, or through the application of leeches, was the most widely practiced medical intervention in the medieval world, applied to an enormous range of conditions on the theory that excess blood was a common cause of illness and that removing some of it would restore humoral balance. For a healthy adult, losing a small amount of blood through this procedure was an inconvenience rather than a danger. For someone already weakened by illness, fever, or injury, precisely the conditions that sent people to seek medical help in the first place, bloodletting could tip the balance from serious illness toward death with what we can now recognize as tragic predictability. Bloodletting was not fringe medicine or folk quackery. It was mainstream, academically respectable, theoretically justified medical practice, endorsed by the most learned physicians, practiced in hospitals and monasteries and royal courts. The barber surgeon who maintained your teeth and lanced your boils also took your blood, and the two-part pole painted in red and white that became the symbol of the barber's profession reportedly derives from the red blood-soaked bandages and white tourniquet that signified bloodletting services. Historians still argue about the actual mortality contribution of bloodletting in the medieval period. Isolating its effects from the underlying conditions that prompted it is methodologically difficult, but the general consensus is that it did more harm than good with a consistency that should have been detectable from clinical observation alone, had the theoretical framework not made the evidence very difficult to interpret correctly. Uroscopy was another major diagnostic tool, and it deserves its own moment because it is one of those medieval medical practices that manages to be simultaneously sophisticated and entirely wrong in a way that captures the period's approach to systematic knowledge rather beautifully. Uroscopy was the examination of urine, its color, clarity, smell, taste in some traditions, and the patterns that formed when it settled in the glass flask called a Jordan, as a diagnostic window into the body's internal state. Medieval medical texts devoted enormous space to the classification of urine types and their corresponding diagnoses, with elaborate color charts and descriptive taxonomies that represented a genuine attempt at systematic clinical observation. The urine did contain information about the body's state, color, and clarity genuinely do reflect hydration, certain dietary factors, and some pathological conditions, and a skilled uroscopist might, in practice, make some useful inferences. But the theoretical framework within which those inferences were made was wrong enough that the overall diagnostic value was considerably less than its practitioners believed. The traveling uroscopist, who moved between villages offering diagnosis based on urine examination, was a recognized figure of medieval medical commerce, and also a recognized figure of medieval skepticism and satire. Various medieval texts take aim at the uroscopist as a fraud, someone whose elaborate interpretive performance masked the reality that they were largely guessing. That this critique appears in the historical record suggests that medieval people were not uniformly credulous recipients of whatever their healers told them, which is a useful corrective to the assumption that pre-scientific medicine was accepted without question. Healthy skepticism about medical practitioners is apparently a timeless human trait. Surgery, in the medieval period, was a real and sometimes effective practice, conducted primarily by barber surgeons rather than learned physicians. The distinction between the university-educated physician who theorized and the practically trained surgeon who actually cut was a significant social and intellectual division in medieval medical culture. Wound surgery, in particular, was an area where medieval practitioners accumulated genuine practical knowledge, driven partly by the chronic warfare of the period which provided a large and involuntary clinical population. The management of arrow wounds, the reduction of fractures, the treatment of battlefield injuries, these were areas where medieval surgical skill developed through sheer volume of practice in ways that produced real expertise. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was performed in the medieval period, and the archaeological evidence of healed trepanation sites on medieval skulls tells us that at least some patients survived the procedure, which is more than you might expect. Anesthesia did not exist in any reliable form. This point requires sitting with for a moment. Every surgical procedure, every tooth extraction, every setting of a broken bone, every lancing of an abscess, every amputation, and amputations happened, particularly in the context of battle injuries and severe infections, was conducted on a conscious patient. The available pain management was limited to alcohol, which has significant limitations as a surgical anesthetic, and to preparations containing opium, henbane, or hemlock, which were dangerous enough in effective doses that their use required careful management by someone who knew what they were doing, and was frequently not available to ordinary people at all. Patients were held down. Surgery was performed as quickly as possible, because speed was the primary mercy available. The medieval surgeon's most valued skill, after anatomical knowledge, was velocity. The hospital, as a medieval institution, was not quite what the word suggests to a modern ear. The earliest medieval hospitals, many of them founded by the church, staffed by religious orders, operating under the understanding that care for the sick was a Christian obligation, were primarily places of shelter and spiritual comfort rather than medical treatment in the clinical sense. They received the poor, the chronically ill, travelers, and the elderly who had no other recourse. They provided food, warmth, nursing care, and the sacraments. The medical treatment they offered was often herbal and dietary rather than surgical or pharmaceutical in any sophisticated sense. This does not make them unimportant. The care they provided was genuine and often the difference between surviving an illness and not, but it situates them differently from the modern hospital, which is primarily a treatment facility rather than a care facility. The plague, when it arrived, and we will spend more time with the Black Death in a later section, overwhelmed every medical framework available because it was new, because it killed so fast, and because the humoral theory had no category for a disease that moved through populations with the speed and indiscriminate lethality of the mid-14th century pandemic. The medical response to the plague was a mixture of sensible practical measures: quarantine, isolation of the sick, disposal of corpses, and interventions that were ineffective or harmful. But the quarantine measures in particular represent a genuine empirical insight operating independently of the theoretical framework, the observation that physical separation of the sick from the healthy reduced transmission, derived from observation rather than theory, and effective for reasons that medieval practitioners could not explain but could nonetheless employ. Here is the fringe detail that tends to get people. Medieval medical texts describe, with considerable seriousness, a condition called worm disease. The belief that various illnesses, including toothache, were caused by worms living inside the body or the affected part. The tooth worm, gnawing at the root, was the medieval explanation for dental pain. Various remedies existed for extracting or killing this worm, including the application of smoke from burning henbane seeds to the affected tooth, on the theory that the worm would emerge from the tooth in response to the heat and could then be collected in a bowl of water. Practitioners would sometimes show patients a small object retrieved from the water as evidence of the expelled worm, in what may have been deliberate theater designed to reassure the patient that the treatment had worked, or may have been genuine belief in the efficacy of the procedure. The line between medieval fraud and medieval sincere delusion was sometimes thin. Your healer this evening is examining your hand. You caught it on something this morning, a rough edge of wood, a tool that slipped, and the cut is deeper than you initially thought, and by late afternoon it is red at the edges in a way that has your attention. Infection in the medieval world was not the manageable inconvenience that antibiotics have made it in ours. An infected wound that was not properly treated could progress to systemic infection with a speed and consequence that we have largely forgotten how to be afraid of, because we have grown up in a world where the default response to infection is a course of tablets and not much drama. Your healer cleans the wound, this, at least, is useful, and applies a poultice of honey, which has genuine antimicrobial properties that medieval practitioners observed empirically even without understanding the mechanism. They may say some words over it. They may make a small sign. The words and the sign are not nothing, either. The psychological effect of a healer's ritual attention on a patient's experience is real and measurable even in modern clinical contexts, which is why placebo-controlled trials exist. You feel, leaving the healer's house, somewhat better than you did before you arrived. Some of this is the honey. Some of this is the attention. Some of this is the simple comfort of having done something about a problem rather than leaving it unaddressed. You walk home in the early dark, hand wrapped in a clean strip of cloth, and you do not think about germ theory. You think about whether the honey poultice will hold until morning, and whether you will be well enough for tomorrow's work, and whether the small prayer you said under your breath as you left the healer's door will find the ear it was directed toward. Whether it will or not, the honey is working. That much is real. The notice comes on a Sunday, delivered after Mass in the way that all official communication reaches your village, through the mouth of someone with the authority or the appointment to speak on behalf of a larger power. The reeve, your village's own administrator, a peasant himself but one elevated to the role of intermediary between the Lord's interests and the community's daily reality, stands outside the church door and reads, or recites from memory if he cannot read, the terms of a new labor obligation. The Lord requires 3 additional days of work on the domain this week, in addition to the standard obligation. The harvest on the Lord's fields is behind. Your labor is owed. This is not a request. This is the feudal system doing what it does, which is converting your time and your body into someone else's agricultural output through a legal and social architecture so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of your world that questioning it feels less like political dissent and more like questioning the weather. Medieval justice and medieval power are two subjects that require careful separation, because they overlapped considerably but were not the same thing, and the gap between them was where most ordinary medieval people spent their legal lives. The formal system of law in medieval Europe was, by modern standards, both surprisingly sophisticated in its theoretical structure and alarmingly arbitrary in its practical application. The gap between the legal principle articulated in the royal court and the legal reality experienced in the village was wide enough to accommodate almost anything, and it frequently did. Let us start with the structure because the structure is genuinely interesting. Medieval England, to take the example we know best from surviving records, developed over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries a remarkably elaborate common law tradition, with traveling royal judges, standardized writs, jury processes, and a body of legal precedent that was being consciously accumulated and organized. The Magna Carta of 1215, whatever its subsequent mythologization, was a real document that asserted real principles about the relationship between royal power and the rights of at least some subjects, initially barons rather than peasants, but principles that expanded their reach over time. The concept that a person should be judged by their peers, that punishment should be proportionate to the offense, that royal power was not unlimited, these were genuinely significant legal ideas that distinguished medieval English law from pure autocracy, even if the gap between the idea and the practice was substantial. For you, standing outside the church after Mass with a new labor obligation ringing in your ears, the sophistication of the royal legal tradition is not immediately relevant. What is relevant is the manorial court, the local legal institution that governed most aspects of your daily life, presided over by the lord or his representative, adjudicating the disputes and infractions of the village community according to local custom and the lord's interests, both of which were interpreted by people who were not neutral parties to the outcomes. The manorial court record is one of the richest sources for medieval social history precisely because it was a working document of real community life, recording actual disputes and actual decisions in language that gives us direct access to the texture of medieval village relationships. Neighbors arguing about boundary markers, disputes over grazing rights on the common, accusations of debt, of damage to crops, of petty theft. The endless, grinding litigation of people living in close proximity with competing interests and no alternative dispute resolution mechanism except the court. The court could fine you, could order you to perform additional labor. It could, in more serious cases, order physical punishment or refer matters to higher jurisdictions with more serious consequences. For the unfree peasant, the serf, technically the villain in the English legal vocabulary, the lord had powers that extended well beyond the merely economic. A villain could not leave the manor without permission, could not marry without the lord's consent and the payment of a fee called merchet, could not have their children educated beyond the level appropriate to their station without permission. The body of the serf was, in a genuine legal sense, the property of the lord, subject to his authority in ways that make the terminology of medieval freedom a deeply relative concept. Historians still argue about the actual lived experience of villanage, whether the legal theory of near-total unfreedom translated into the day-to-day reality of most serfs' lives, or whether the practical gap between legal status and actual treatment was wide enough that many villains lived with a degree of autonomy that their formal legal position would not suggest. The evidence from manorial records suggests considerable variation. Lords who were resident and attentive to the detailed exercise of their rights over their villains, and lords who were absentee and whose theoretical powers were rarely practically enforced. The law as written and the law as lived were different documents in the medieval period to a degree that makes simple generalizations dangerous. The criminal law, as opposed to the civil and manorial law, operated through a mixture of royal courts, ecclesiastical courts, and local jurisdictions whose overlapping authorities created a map of legal responsibility that was, from the inside, bewildering in its complexity. The Church maintained its own court system, the ecclesiastical courts, with jurisdiction over matters including marriage, wills, sexual conduct, and the behavior of clergy, And this parallel legal universe operated according to canon law rather than common law, with different procedures and different penalties. The benefit of clergy. The provision that clergy could claim trial in the ecclesiastical courts rather than the royal courts, even for serious criminal offenses, was a significant privilege because ecclesiastical punishment was generally lighter than royal punishment for equivalent offenses. The boundary of who counted as clergy for this purpose was actively contested and occasionally exploited in ways that the modern legal mind would recognize as creative interpretation. The punishments available to medieval courts were, by modern standards, physically severe and calibrated on a different understanding of what punishment was for. The modern penal philosophy, however imperfectly executed, centers on rehabilitation, deterrence, and proportionate punishment. The medieval philosophy centered on making punishment visible, public, and legible to the community as a demonstration of the order that the law was protecting. Execution was public. Whipping was public. The pillory and the stocks were inherently public. They placed the offender in the middle of the community, physically restrained and available to the attention of passers-by, which might mean rotten vegetables or worse depending on the crime and the mood of the crowd. These were not incidental features of the punishment. They were the point. The spectacle was the message. The range of offenses that attracted capital punishment in the medieval period was wider than modern sensibility finds comfortable. Theft above a certain value was a hanging offense. Poaching the king's deer was a hanging offense, or at minimum an offense that attracted the removal of eyes or hands in earlier periods, which was arguably worse. The forest law, the body of regulation governing the royal forests, those reserved hunting grounds that covered significant portions of the English countryside, was one of the most resented aspects of medieval royal governance, because it imposed severe penalties for activities that ordinary people had previously considered their right: hunting, gathering wood, clearing land. The Norman imposition of forest law after 1066 was remembered with bitterness in English sources for generations, which tells you something about the relationship between law and legitimacy and how long institutional grievances can persist in community memory. Trial by ordeal is the medieval legal procedure that most captures the modern imagination, partly because it seems so alien and partly because it operates on a premise that God will intervene in the physical world to protect the innocent, that is so remote from modern evidentiary standards. The ordeals took several forms: ordeal by hot iron, where the accused carried a piece of heated metal for a prescribed distance and the wound was examined after 3 days, with clean healing taken as divine indication of innocence; ordeal by hot water, where the accused plunged their hand into boiling water; ordeal by cold water, where the accused was thrown into water, with floating indicating guilt on the theory that the pure water would reject the guilty person. Ordeal by combat, trial by battle, was available in certain civil disputes, where the parties or their champions fought with the outcome determining the legal verdict. The Church formally prohibited clerical participation in ordeals in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, and without clerical participation the rituals lost their theological framework and fell into disuse relatively quickly in most jurisdictions. What replaced the ordeal as the primary fact-finding mechanism was the jury, a group of local men with knowledge of the parties and the circumstances, required to deliver a verdict, which was in many ways a more rational approach to determining truth, though it came with its own vulnerabilities to bias, intimidation, and the general messiness of community politics. Here is the genuinely striking quirky detail. There is documented evidence from medieval English court records of animals being prosecuted for criminal offenses. Pigs, most commonly, tried and executed for the killing of human beings, particularly children, who were vulnerable to attack from the semi-feral domestic pigs that roamed medieval villages with considerable freedom. The trials were conducted with procedural seriousness, with the animal held in custody, represented by legal counsel in some cases, tried before a court, and, if convicted, executed in a manner calibrated to the offense. Modern historians have interpreted these animal trials variously as expressions of a legal philosophy that held the physical world accountable to moral order, as community rituals for processing the trauma of violent death, or as practical legal mechanisms for addressing property disputes when the animal in question was owned by someone of status. Whatever their function, the medieval pig trial has a particular quality of surreal seriousness that illuminates how different the underlying assumptions of medieval legal culture were from our own. The power that the feudal system held over your daily life was not only exercised through formal legal mechanisms. It was embedded in the physical and economic landscape in ways that were so pervasive as to be almost invisible, the way that background conditions are always almost invisible to the people living inside them. The Lord's mill was the only mill. You were required to grind your grain there and to pay for the privilege. The Lord's oven was the only oven large enough for bread baking, and you paid to use it. The Lord's court was the court. The Lord's forest was the forest. The structures that organized your economic life, the common fields, the common pasture, the shared resources of the village community, existed within a framework of obligations that flowed upward, from you to the Lord, from the Lord to the greater Lord above him, and from there to the king, and from there, in the medieval understanding, to God. This vertical hierarchy of obligation was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a cosmological one. The three orders of medieval society, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, were understood not as a politically contingent arrangement that might be renegotiated, but as a divinely ordained structure that reflected the natural order of things. Your place in it was not an accident of birth to be overcome, but a station assigned by Providence to be occupied with appropriate virtue. The sermon literature, the conduct literature, the theological justifications for the social order, all of these reinforced, continuously and from authoritative positions, the idea that your labor and your submission were not merely required but right, good even, part of a cosmic arrangement whose justice might not be visible in this life but would certainly be apparent in the next. This is one of those historical perspectives that requires genuine imaginative effort to inhabit without condescension, because it is simultaneously a tool of oppression and a genuine source of psychological stability. The person who understands their suffering as meaningful, as part of a larger ordered whole, as temporary in the context of eternity, has a different relationship with that suffering than the person who understands it as arbitrary and without purpose. Medieval peasants were not uniformly accepting of their lot. The evidence of resistance, from small acts of work slowdown and petty appropriation to the large-scale peasant rebellions that punctuated the later medieval period, is consistent and robust. But the cosmological framework within which even resistance operated was different from modern political consciousness in ways that affect how we should read both the compliance and the revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, one of the most dramatic and well-documented episodes of medieval popular uprising, produced the figure of John Ball, the priest whose radical theology held that the social hierarchy was not divinely ordained but humanly constructed and could be humanly dismantled. His famous couplet, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" is one of the most compressed and powerful challenges to the ideological foundations of the feudal order in the historical record. The revolt was suppressed. Ball was executed. But the questions he articulated did not go away, and the social order he challenged was already, by 1381, under pressures demographic, economic, intellectual, that would ultimately transform it beyond recognition. For now, though, you are a peasant in an earlier and more settled century, and the reeve has finished reciting the Lord's requirements, and the congregation is dispersing into the Sunday morning, and the additional labor obligation is simply a fact to be accommodated in the week's planning. You adjust, you calculate, you figure out which of the scheduled tasks can be deferred and which cannot. The law has spoken through its local instrument, and you have heard it. You go home for your Sunday meal, which is slightly better than weekday meals because Sunday is Sunday, and even in the hardest circumstances, the human instinct to mark the sacred day with something a little extra, a bit more meat in the pottage, perhaps, or a slightly better loaf, persists with the tenacity of all deeply human things. The child standing at the edge of the field is approximately 7 years old, and they have been working since shortly after dawn. Not playing near the field, not watching the work with the idle curiosity of childhood, working, with a specific assigned task that requires sustained attention and physical presence for most of the daylight hours. Their job today is bird scaring. Walking the length of the newly sown strips, waving their arms, making noise, driving off the rooks and pigeons and sparrows that would otherwise consume a meaningful percentage of the seed before it has any chance to become grain. It is repetitive, it is cold, it is lonely in the particular way that solitary outdoor work is lonely, and it is absolutely essential to the household's economic survival. The child knows this. They have known it, in the practical, unsentimental way that medieval children knew things, since they were old enough to understand the connection between seed and harvest and bread and winter. This is not a scene of abuse or neglect. This is medieval childhood doing exactly what medieval childhood was designed to do, which was to integrate children into the productive life of the household as quickly and completely as their developing physical capacities allowed. The concept of childhood as a protected period of play, learning, and gradual preparation for adult life, the concept that most modern people take as so natural it barely seems like a concept at all, is a relatively recent historical construction, and its absence from the medieval world is one of the aspects of that world that most consistently disturbs the modern imagination. The French historian Philippe Aries made the influential and controversial argument in the 1960s that medieval people did not have a concept of childhood as a distinct life stage, that children were treated essentially as small adults from the moment they were physically capable of contributing to household labor, and that the emotional investment in children that modern parents consider natural was structurally limited by the high rates of child mortality that made deep attachment to individual children an emotional risk that medieval adults learned, consciously or not, to hedge against. Aries's thesis has been substantially revised and in some respects refuted by subsequent scholarship. The evidence of genuine parental grief at child deaths, of emotional investment in individual children, of awareness that children were different from adults and needed different treatment, is too consistent across too many sources to support the strongest version of his argument. Historians still argue about the precise nature of medieval childhood as an experience and as a cultural concept, but the debate has moved on from Aries's binary of childhood existed versus childhood did not exist to more nuanced questions about what kind of childhood existed, for whom, and under what conditions. What is not disputed is the labor. Children worked consistently and from an early age across every social level, because the medieval economy ran on human muscle and there was no category of person, however young, whose contribution could be casually dispensed with. The specific tasks assigned to children were calibrated to their physical capabilities: bird scaring, gathering, simple animal tending, carrying, fetching water, the lighter forms of agricultural assistance, but the principle that children were economic participants rather than economic dependents was fundamental. A household with several children of working age was, in purely practical terms, a wealthier household than one without because it had more labor units, which is a clinical way of describing something that also had genuine human warmth and complexity, but which we should not romanticize to the point of obscuring its economic foundation. The birth itself, the entry into this world, was an event that took place in the domestic space, attended by the midwife and the women of the family and community, without the presence of men, who waited outside and were informed of the outcome when it was determined. Medieval childbirth was dangerous in ways that modern obstetrics has largely eliminated from the experience of women in wealthy countries. Maternal mortality in the medieval period was significant. Estimates vary widely depending on the source and methodology, but the general consensus places it at a level that made childbirth a recognized major life risk, something that women prepared for with the specific preparations one makes before entering a situation that might not end well. The making of wills before labor, the specific prayers and saints invoked for protection in childbirth, the elaborate social rituals surrounding the event, all of these reflect a clear-eyed awareness of the stakes that is genuinely moving to encounter in the historical record. Saint Margaret of Antioch was the patron saint of childbirth, and her legend, in which she was swallowed by a dragon and burst out of its belly intact, a narrative that mapped conveniently onto the specific anxieties of labor, made her one of the most widely invoked saints in medieval devotional life. Her girdle, or various objects claimed to be her girdle, was carried or pressed against the laboring woman's body as a protective talisman, and the trade in such relics was brisk enough to support the inference that the demand was widespread and the consolation they provided was real, regardless of their authenticity. Even Westminster Abbey possessed a relic associated with the Virgin Mary that was specifically loaned to women of the royal family during labor. The intersection of official religion, folk practice, and the very human need for reassurance in terrifying circumstances produced a rich and complex devotional culture around childbirth that tells us as much about medieval emotional life as any other single source. The infant, if it survived, and infant mortality in the first year of life was high enough that medieval baptismal practice emphasized urgency, with emergency baptism of infants who appeared unlikely to survive being a recognized and doctrinally supported practice, because dying unbaptized carried spiritual consequences that medieval theology took very seriously, was swaddled in the tight wrapping that was the universal medieval approach to infant care. Swaddling, binding the infant's limbs tightly against its body in strips of cloth, was practiced across every social class and recommended in every medical and childcare text of the period, on the theory that it prevented limb deformity, kept the infant warm, and allowed the caregiver to put the child down safely while attending to other tasks. Modern pediatrics has mixed views on tight swaddling, but the medieval approach was a genuine attempt at infant care based on the best available understanding, and the practice of securing an infant so that they could be placed in a hanging cradle or propped against a surface while the mother worked was a practical adaptation to the reality of a life in which maternal work could not simply stop because there was a baby. Breastfeeding, when it occurred, and it generally did for as long as the mother could manage it, because breast milk was the safest food available to infants and everyone knew it even without understanding the immunological reasons, provided both nutrition and a degree of contraceptive effect that was understood, if not in those terms, from long experience. The spacing of medieval births, where maternal nursing was maintained, was partly a function of this biological mechanism. Among wealthier families, where wet nurses were employed, because nursing was seen as incompatible with the resumption of marital relations, and the social pressure on noble women to produce heirs was intense, children were often weaned early, sent to wet nurses, and the contraceptive effect was lost, contributing to the higher birth rates and shorter birth spacing documented in noble families compared to peasant ones. This is one of those ironies of history where the apparently less privileged arrangement produced better outcomes for maternal and child health, without anyone at the time having the framework to recognize it as such. Apprenticeship, the formal arrangement whereby a child, typically around the age of 7 to 14 depending on the trade and the circumstance, was placed in the household of a master craftsman to learn a trade through years of practical immersion, was the primary educational pathway for children destined for skilled craft work. The apprentice lived in the master's household, worked as a domestic servant as well as a craft learner, received food, shelter, and training in exchange for labor, and gradually, over a period that might stretch to 7 years or more, accumulated the skills necessary to practice the trade independently. The system was codified by the guilds that organized most urban craft production, with formal contracts, regulated conditions, and a graduated progression from apprentice to journeyman to master that provided a structured career ladder of sorts. For the vast majority of children, however, the rural children, the peasant children, the children without the family connections or resources to arrange a craft apprenticeship, the education available was the education of observation and participation. You learned farming by farming alongside your parents from earliest childhood. You learned household management by managing a household. You learned the specific local knowledge, which fields drained slowly, which weather signs predicted rain, which plants were useful and which were not, by absorbing it from the people around you over years of immersion. This was not a lesser education, it was a different kind of education, comprehensive and practical and deeply embedded in the specific place and community. And it produced people who were extraordinarily competent at the life they were going to live, even if they were entirely unequipped for any other. Literacy was not a widespread skill in the medieval peasant population, and should not be expected to be, given that the economic and practical incentives for literacy were limited for people whose entire working life required no reading. The village priest might be able to read, though the literacy of the lower clergy was variable enough that this was not guaranteed. The Lord Steward certainly needed to read and write, as the manorial accounts and legal documents that survive in their thousands attest. Merchants required literacy for their commercial operations. But the peasant who could neither read nor write was not thereby excluded from the intellectual and cultural life of the community, because the primary media of that culture were oral and visual. The sermon, the story, the song, the image, the painted walls of the church, the carved capitals of the columns, the stained glass where it existed, communicated the narratives and values of medieval culture to people who could not read a letter. Memory was the storage medium of an oral culture, and medieval memory was cultivated and exercised to a degree that the text-dependent modern mind finds difficult to appreciate. The capacity to hold and accurately reproduce long texts, complex genealogies, intricate legal customs, and extensive bodies of practical knowledge in memory alone was not a special talent but a standard competency. developed through a lifetime of practice in a world where writing was not available as an external memory aid for most purposes. The medieval storyteller, the bard, the village elder with their accumulated knowledge of local custom and land history. These were the living libraries of their communities, and their deaths represented genuine losses of information that could not be recovered from any archive. Play existed. It is worth saying this plainly, because the weight of medieval childhood's labor and responsibility can create an impression of unrelieved grimness that the evidence does not fully support. Medieval children played. The archaeological record of medieval sites produces toys. Small clay figures, wooden dolls, balls, knucklebones, spinning tops, miniature versions of adult tools that served as both play objects and training implements. Medieval manuscript illustrations show children playing games recognizable across centuries: ball games, tag, games involving running and catching, and the basic physical exuberance of young bodies discovering what they can do. The games had names, rules, and seasonal associations. Some of them are ancestral to games still played today. The apprentice who spent their evenings playing dice with other young workers in the city. The village children who chased each other across the common on summer evenings before the light failed. The adolescent boys who competed in wrestling and running, and the physical contests that every culture uses to establish hierarchy among the young. These moments existed alongside the labor, within the labor, threading through the long working days in the small stolen moments that children have always found regardless of adult expectations. The medieval child was not a miniature adult in the sense of having no access to the lightness and physicality of youth. They were a miniature adult in the sense that the lightness had to coexist with responsibilities that modern childhood has largely deferred. Death came for medieval children with a frequency that structured everything around it. The churchyard beside the village church contained the graves of children who had not survived infancy, children who had died of the fevers and respiratory illnesses and digestive diseases that swept through communities without the intervention of modern medicine, children who had died in the accidents that a life of agricultural labor in proximity to animals and bladed tools and open fires regularly produced. The presence of child death in medieval community life was not hidden or exceptional. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary experience, mourned genuinely, and then accommodated with the resilience that accommodation of the inevitable requires. The child at the edge of the field has been at it for 4 hours now. The light is shifting, the morning opening into midday, and the rooks have retreated to the tree line in temporary defeat. The child stops walking, stops waving, and stands still for a moment in the pale winter sun with their face turned upward, eyes closed, in the posture of someone experiencing a small and uncomplicated pleasure. The warmth of the sun on a cold face. The particular animal comfort of stillness after motion. The brief respite before the rooks regroup and the waving must begin again. Even in the hardest life, these moments happen. They have always happened. They will always happen. The sun is warm on the upturned face, and for a moment the field and the obligation and the cold and the long day ahead recede, and there is only the light. The summer of 1315 begins badly and then becomes something else entirely, something for which the people living through it have no adequate frame of reference because nothing in living memory, nothing in the stories of the oldest people in the village, has prepared them for what is coming. The rain starts in the spring and does not stop. It rains through May and June with a persistence that moves from concerning to alarming to something beyond alarming, into a register that does not have a name yet but will eventually be called the Great Famine, the worst subsistence crisis in Northern Europe for several centuries. And the people standing in their flooded fields in the summer of 1315 are at the very beginning of it without knowing how long it will last or how bad it will get. You are going to spend some time tonight in the company of catastrophe, because catastrophe was not an interruption of medieval life. It was a structural feature of it, recurring with enough regularity that the medieval understanding of time and history was shaped fundamentally by its presence. The modern experience of material security, the deep background assumption that the food supply will not fail, that the infrastructure will broadly hold, that the catastrophes reported on the news are happening to other people in other places, is historically very unusual. For most of human history, and for medieval people in particular, catastrophe was a when rather than an if, and the psychological and social adaptations required to live with that knowledge were woven into the culture at every level. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe over its 7-year course. The numbers are estimates, drawn from fragmentary sources and extrapolated with the methods and uncertainties that medieval demographic history requires, but even the conservative end of the range represents a human catastrophe of staggering scale. The mechanism was relatively simple and absolutely merciless. Several consecutive years of cold, wet weather failed the harvests. Failed them not once, not twice, but repeatedly, so that the grain stores that might have buffered one bad year were depleted before the second bad year arrived, and utterly exhausted before the third. Animals died. Seed grain was eaten. The economic and nutritional resilience of communities that had been built up over generations was consumed, year by year, until there was nothing left to consume. The social consequences cascaded outward from hunger in ways that modern emergency management professionals would recognize as the standard pattern of famine. First the poor, then the middling, then everyone. Crime increased as people stole food. Violence increased as competition for scarce resources removed the inhibitions that ordinary social functioning maintained. Families made impossible choices about who would eat and who would not. People ate things they would not normally eat. The records mention cats, dogs, and things more disturbing that the sources describe with the circumspection of writers who cannot quite bring themselves to be specific. The social fabric frayed in specific, documented ways. The abandonment of children who could not be fed, the dissolution of communities as people dispersed in search of food, the collapse of the labor arrangements and credit relationships that held the agricultural economy together. What is striking, reading the sources from this period, is not the despair, though the despair is there, visible in chronicles and in the sudden demographic holes that the records show, but the adaptation. The persistence of human beings in finding ways to continue, to improvise, to maintain some version of social structure even under extreme pressure. The village communities that survived the Great Famine did so partly through collective action, through the sharing of resources that made communal survival possible where individual survival would not have been, through the activation of social bonds that the ordinary, non-crisis circumstances of village life had built up over generations. The mutual obligation of the community, which in ordinary times felt like a constraint, revealed itself in crisis as a survival technology. The Great Famine was barely a generation past. Its survivors still alive, its memory still raw in the community consciousness, when the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and if the famine had tested the adaptive capacity of medieval society to its limits, the plague demolished the limits entirely and kept going. You need to sit with what the Black Death actually was, demographically, because the numbers are so large that they tend to become abstract in a way that obscures rather than illuminates. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through the bites of fleas that had fed on infected rodents, though pneumonic and septicemic forms with different transmission routes also contributed, killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe between 1347 and 1353. In some regions, mortality was higher. In some cities, entire quarters were emptied. Some villages were abandoned entirely, their populations gone, the buildings standing empty until they slowly collapsed back into the fields that had fed them. 30 to 50%. Take the population of wherever you are right now, your city, your country, and remove between a third and a half of the people. Not gradually, not spread over decades, but within 5 years. Within 18 months in most affected areas. The speed was part of what made it psychologically devastating in a way that mere death toll numbers cannot capture. People were well in the morning and dead by evening. Families were gone within days. The social infrastructure for managing death, the priests to administer last rites, the gravediggers to manage burial, the networks of mutual support that communities maintained, was overwhelmed so completely that in many places it ceased to function, and bodies were buried in mass graves without ceremony, or not buried at all, which in the medieval theological framework was a spiritual catastrophe layered on top of the physical one. The medical response, as we touched on in our earlier conversation about healers and humors, had nothing effective to offer. The miasma theory, the idea that plague was transmitted through corrupted air, bad smells, the atmospheric emanation of putrefying matter, led to interventions like burning aromatic substances and avoiding the proximity of the sick that were, at best, accidentally partially effective and, at worst, useless. The theory that planetary alignments had created the atmospheric conditions for the disease was taken seriously by learned physicians and used to generate astrological recommendations for avoidance that had no practical value whatsoever. The observation that flight was the most effective available response. Getting away from affected areas before the disease arrived, and staying away until it passed, was widely noted and acted upon by those with the resources to flee, which meant that the wealthy fled and the poor stayed, and the mortality among the poor was correspondingly higher, which has a grim modernity to it. Historians still argue about the precise biological identity of the Black Death, whether it was indeed primarily bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, or whether other disease agents may have been involved in what looks from the historical record like an unusually fast-moving and multimodal epidemic. The genetic evidence from excavated plague burials has strengthened the Yersinia pestis identification considerably, but questions about why the 14th century pandemic moved so much faster and killed so much more lethally than later documented outbreaks of bubonic plague continue to generate scholarly debate about host immunity, bacterial virulence, transmission routes, and the role of co-occurring diseases in a population already weakened by the preceding decades of famine and climate disruption. The social and cultural aftermath of the Black Death is impossible to overstate. A civilization that lost a third to half of its population in 5 years was, in every conceivable way, transformed by the experience. The labor shortage that followed the mortality was so acute that it fundamentally altered the economic relationship between peasants and lords. Suddenly, labor was scarce and could demand better terms, and the attempts by the English crown to artificially maintain pre-plague wage levels through the Statute of Laborers of 1351 were both economically logical from the perspective of the established order and practically unenforceable in the face of a labor market that had been restructured by death. The peasant who survived the Black Death found themselves in a paradoxical position. The heir to the dead, with access to land and resources that had previously been unavailable. In a world where the old constraints of the feudal order were loosening under pressures that the order itself had not anticipated and could not fully contain. The flagellant movement. Groups of people who traveled between towns whipping themselves publicly in acts of extreme penitential devotion, seeking to appease what they understood as divine punishment for human sin, emerged from the plague years as one of the more dramatic cultural responses to catastrophe. The flagellants were condemned by the Church, partly because their theology implied a capacity for self-administered salvation that bypassed ecclesiastical mediation, and partly because their movement had an energy that the institutional church found difficult to direct and potentially dangerous. The dancing mania, episodes of mass dancing that were recorded in various European cities in the late medieval period, where large numbers of people danced compulsively for hours or days, has been interpreted variously as a physical symptom of disease, as a form of collective psychological crisis, as a religious movement, and as social theater of a specific kind. Whatever its precise nature, it belongs to the category of collective human responses to extreme stress that history records with some regularity when communities experience trauma beyond the capacity of normal cultural processing. The wars deserve their own moment, because warfare was not an occasional dramatic interruption of medieval life but a near-constant background condition. The feudal system was, at its structural foundation, a military system. The lord's obligation upward was military service, and his power downward rested ultimately on military force. The knight, the armored mounted warrior who is the central figure of medieval military mythology, was the product of an enormous investment of resources. The horse, the armor, the years of training, the supporting infrastructure of squires and servants. This investment was justified by the military value that the armored cavalry provided, which was genuinely significant in the warfare of the early and central medieval periods, even if its dominance was eventually challenged by the longbow, the pike, and the cannon as the technology of war evolved. For you, the peasant, warfare manifested in several distinct and equally unpleasant ways. First, the direct obligation of military service, which varied by region and period but could require you to appear for military duty, equipped at your own expense with whatever weapons your social station was deemed to require. Second, the passage of armies through your area, which was in practice an organized looting exercise regardless of whether the army in question was notionally friendly or hostile. Soldiers needed to eat, and the simplest way to feed an army was to take food from the people whose land you were passing through. Third, the specific targeting of agricultural infrastructure as a deliberate military strategy, burning crops, destroying mills, killing livestock, and generally eliminating the productive capacity of enemy territory was a recognized and widely practiced approach to warfare that had immediate and devastating effects on the civilian population of the affected areas. The Chevachi, the mounted raid through enemy territory, burning and destroying as it went, was a standard English military tactic in the Hundred Years' War, and the French civilians whose crops and homes were burned during Edward the Black Prince's Great Raid of 1355 were not accidental casualties of military action, but the explicit intended targets of a strategy designed to damage the French crown by demonstrating its inability to protect its own people. The gap between the chivalric ideals of knightly conduct, the protection of the weak, the sparing of non-combatants, and the actual practice of medieval warfare was wide enough to accommodate quite a lot of burning and looting, and the theoretical framework of chivalry functioned more as a code governing the treatment of other knights than as meaningful protection for peasants who happened to be in the way. Here is the quirky and strangely humanizing detail from the landscape of medieval catastrophe. During outbreaks of plague, there are documented cases of people leaving food and goods at designated collection points outside infected villages, for the use of the village's surviving inhabitants, with payment left in bowls of water or vinegar on the theory that the liquid would prevent transmission of the disease through the coins. The logic was wrong, coin transmission was not the primary route. But the impulse was right, and the image of people maintaining at a distance the obligations of mutual support that they could not safely fulfill in person is one of those small historical details that seems to illuminate something fundamental and enduring about human social instinct. The community did not end at the edge of the infected village. It stretched across the gap, imperfectly and at a distance, but it stretched. The sky above your village in the hard years does not look different from the sky above your village in the good years. The stars that medieval people used to navigate and plant by and tell time with and pray toward are the same stars regardless of what is happening below them. The Church teaches that suffering is meaningful, that the catastrophes of history are part of a providential plan whose justice will be revealed in eschatological time. Whether this teaching provided comfort or merely described a position that had to be occupied because no alternative was available is one of those questions that cannot be answered from the outside of the experience, and perhaps not fully from the inside either. You have survived things. You carry them. The year the harvest failed and the family ate the seed grain and planted nothing in spring, and it was a near thing, it was a very near thing. The neighbor who was gone between 1 week and the next. The grave dug before the priest arrived because waiting was not an option. The soldiers who came through in the summer and took the better pig, and there was nothing to say about it. Nothing to do except watch them go and assess what remained and start again from what remained. Starting again from what remained. This is perhaps the most medieval thing of all. Not the poverty, not the labor, not the hierarchy and the injustice and the cold mornings and the smoky rooms. The starting again. The assessment of what remains and the decision, made without drama and without alternative, to begin again from there. The stars are the same. The field is smaller than it was. You pick up your tools. The night comes early in winter, and in the medieval world, the coming of darkness is not an inconvenience to be managed with the flick of a switch but a genuine and total transformation of the available world. The sun drops below the horizon and takes with it most of what the day permitted. Movement, work, social interaction beyond the household, the reading of faces and landscapes and all the visual information that human beings use to navigate their relationships with the world and with each other. What remains is the firelight, the rushlight if you can afford it, the particular quality of darkness in a building without glass windows that is several shades deeper than anything most modern people have experienced outside of a power outage. This is the darkness that medieval people went to sleep in and woke within and organized their inner lives around in ways that the perpetually illuminated modern world has largely lost access to. We have been traveling through this medieval day for some time now, and we have covered a considerable amount of difficult ground together. The cold mornings and the smoky rooms and the pottage and the lice and the bloodletting and the arbitrary justice and the children working in frozen fields and the plague rolling across the landscape like something from a nightmare that turns out to be real. It has been, by any honest accounting, a hard journey. And yet here, at the end of it, in the firelight, with the day's work finally, genuinely done, something shifts. Something that has been held tightly all day begins, very slowly, to release. Sleep, in the medieval world, was both simpler and stranger than the modern version. Simpler because the conditions that produce it, physical exhaustion, darkness, the absence of artificial stimulation, the natural drop in temperature that the body reads as a signal for rest, were present in force every single evening without negotiation or supplement. You did not lie awake scrolling. You did not have a complicated relationship with your phone. You did not experience the particular modern affliction of being too tired to sleep but too wired to rest, the cognitive overstimulation of a world that provides more input than any nervous system was designed to process. You were tired in the clean, uncomplicated way that hard physical labor produces, a tiredness that reached into your muscles and your bones and your eyes and made the straw pallet on the floor feel, genuinely, like the best available surface in the world. Stranger because, as we touched on at the very beginning of tonight's journey, the structure of medieval sleep was different from the 8-hour consolidated block that modern sleep science treats as the norm. The segmented sleep pattern, first sleep, a period of waking, second sleep, meant that the middle of the night was not simply an unconscious gap between evening and morning but a recognized period of activity, quiet and interior in quality, belonging to a register of experience distinct from both waking day life and deep sleep. The wakeful hours between the two sleep phases were described in medieval sources as a time for prayer, for reflection, for the processing of dreams, for the gentle conversations that the crowded sociability of daylight hours did not easily accommodate. There is something almost meditative about the picture this creates, the household lying in the dark, the fire burned to embers, one or two people awake in the deep quiet of 2 in the morning, not anxious about being awake but simply present in it, inhabiting the night with the comfortable familiarity of people for whom this hour is a known and expected territory. Dreams were significant in the medieval world in a way that the modern secularized mind finds slightly difficult to fully inhabit. Not significant in the casual modern sense of interesting and worth mentioning over breakfast, but significant in the sense of potentially meaningful, potentially communicative, potentially a genuine channel through which divine, diabolical, or natural forces conveyed information to the sleeper. The dream literature of the medieval period, the dream vision poems, the theological discussions of dream classification, the practical guidance on interpreting dreams found in various popular texts, reflects a culture that took the sleeping mind seriously as a site of real experience rather than merely neurological noise. Chaucer's Dream Visions, Langland's Piers Plowman, the Roman de la Rose. Some of the most significant literary works of the medieval period are structured as dreams, which is not merely a narrative device but a reflection of a genuine cultural understanding of dream experience as a mode of access to truths not available in waking life. The classification of dreams was a serious intellectual undertaking. Macrobius, the late ancient commentator whose work was widely read in the medieval period, distinguished between the somnium, the enigmatic dream requiring interpretation, the visio, the prophetic dream showing future events directly, the oraculum, the dream in which a divine or authoritative figure delivers a message, the insomnium, the meaningless dream produced by daily anxieties and physical states, and the visum, the apparition experienced in the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping. This taxonomy was not a curiosity but a working framework used by medieval people to assess and respond to their dream experiences, deciding which dreams required attention and action and which could be safely dismissed as the insomnium of an overworked mind. Historians still argue about the extent to which this learned classification framework actually shaped the dream experiences of ordinary people versus the literate elite, and whether popular dream interpretation drew on the same traditions or operated according to different and less formally articulated principles. The bed itself, the actual physical arrangement of sleeping, tells its own social story. For the wealthy, the bed was a major piece of furniture and a significant status symbol. The great curtained bed of a medieval lord or lady, with its carved wooden frame, its feather mattress, its multiple layers of linen and wool, its curtains that could be drawn to create a private space within the communal sleeping hall, represented an investment comparable to a modern luxury car, and served a similar function as visible evidence of social standing. The bed was inherited. The bed was inventoried in wills. The bed was, in the households of the prosperous, the single most expensive domestic object, and its quality was a legible marker of the household's position in the social hierarchy. For you, on your straw pallet on the packed earth floor, The bed is a more democratic and considerably less comfortable arrangement. The straw is changed periodically, more often in summer, less often in winter when getting fresh straw requires more effort than the benefit justifies, and supplemented with whatever dried plant material serves as additional insulation and fragrance. The blanket or blankets are wool, worn but warm, shared between multiple bodies that are themselves the primary heat source. The closeness is not a privacy violation in a world where privacy, as we have established, is not an organizing principle of domestic life. It is simply warmth, the most basic and valuable thing the night has to offer. There was, in the medieval period, a practice called bundling or bed sharing with guests that modern sensibilities find confusing but that medieval pragmatism found entirely unremarkable. Travelers arriving at an inn or a household might share a bed with strangers of the same sex, and occasionally of mixed sexes with various arrangements of clothing and positioning intended to maintain appropriate boundaries, simply because beds were expensive, space was limited, and the cold was real. The modern assumption that bed sharing implies intimacy is a relatively recent one, produced by the gradual privatization of sleeping arrangements that accompanied rising living standards. In the medieval world, the bed was a practical resource managed communally, like the fire and the water and the common land, and the intimacy of shared sleep was calibrated differently. The sounds of a medieval night are worth attending to because they are one of the more alien aspects of the experience from a modern perspective. The near-total absence of artificial light was matched by the near-total absence of artificial sound. No traffic, no electrical hum, no distant sirens, no white noise machine. What remained was the natural soundscape. The fire settling and popping, the animals shifting in their half of the building, the wind finding the gaps in the walls and the thatch, the occasional sound from neighboring households carried through the close-packed village air. Owls, dogs, the creak of wood in the cold, the breathing of the people sleeping around you, the small sounds of sleep, the particular rhythm of each person's breathing as familiar as their face, more familiar in the dark. The church bell, if your village was large enough to have a functioning bell, marked the canonical hours through the night. Compline at the end of the evening, matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn. The monastery, where the full liturgical cycle was observed with absolute regularity, structured its entire existence around these hours of prayer, and the bell that rang out across the fields and the village was a temporal anchor connecting the secular world to the sacred rhythm that the monks maintained on behalf of everyone. Even if you did not rise for matins, and most peasants did not, having neither the obligation nor the energy, the sound of the bell in the deep night was a kind of reassurance, a signal that the structure was holding, that someone was maintaining the vigil, that the darkness was inhabited and attended. The relationship between medieval people and the night was more complex and more inhabited than the simple equation of darkness with fear that the modern imagination tends to supply. Yes, the night had dangers, the real dangers of fire and accident and the less rational but genuinely felt dangers of the supernatural forces that medieval cosmology populated the darkness with. The night was the time of wandering spirits, of malevolent entities, of the wild hunt riding across the winter sky. The prayers said at bedtime, the holy water kept by the door, the blessed candle that could be lit in extremis. These were not the paranoid rituals of an irrational culture, but the practical precautions of a culture that took seriously the full range of forces it believed to be operating in the world. But the night was also the time of rest, of the cessation of obligation, of the return to the self that the day's unrelenting demands had temporarily displaced. Medieval devotional literature speaks with considerable beauty about the night as a time of particular closeness to God. The silence, the darkness, the stripping away of the day's distractions creating conditions for an interiority that daylight business prevented. The psalms that were sung at Compline, the night prayer that closed the monastic day, included the words that have been translated as, "I will both lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety." And the emotional register of those words, the specific comfort they offered to people going to sleep in a world that provided very little guarantee of waking, speaks to something real and human that the historical distance does not diminish. What did medieval people make of their lives? This is perhaps the question that tonight's journey has been circling without quite asking directly, and it deserves a moment's honest attention before we close. The evidence. And there is more of it than people expect, in the wills and the letters and the legal records and the poetry and the art and the religious texts and the small material objects recovered from the earth. Suggests people who understood their lives as hard and also as meaningful, as circumscribed and also as full, as temporary and also as connected to something larger and more permanent than any individual existence. The medieval sense of self was less individuated than the modern one, less focused on personal fulfillment and self-actualization as primary goods, and more oriented toward community, duty, devotion, and the salvation of the soul as the ultimate purpose of the time spent alive. This does not mean they did not want better. The record of complaint, of resistance, of the longing for relief from labor and cold and hunger, is consistent and human. The peasant who worked the Lord's fields with less than full enthusiasm was not a philosophical objector to the feudal system. They were a tired person who would rather have been doing something else. The woman who prayed to Saint Margaret before her labor was not making a theological statement. She was frightened and reaching for whatever reassurance was available. The child in the field, face turned up to the winter sun in a moment of stolen warmth, remember that child, from a few sections back, was not reflecting on the historical construction of childhood. They were just a child, briefly warm, briefly still, briefly entirely themselves in a moment that asked nothing of them. The quirky footnote to close this historical tour: there is a medieval bedtime prayer recorded in several English sources that asks God for protection specifically from nightmares, from the creatures believed to cause them, the mare, a supernatural being thought to ride sleeping people and produce the sensation of weight and terror that we now understand as sleep paralysis, and from the general hazards of the night. The prayer is practical and specific and slightly desperate in the way that bedtime prayers often are, and it was said by real people in real beds in real darkness, addressing real fears in the only language available to them. Whether the prayer worked is not the right question. The right question is what it felt like to say it, and to mean it, and to close your eyes in the dark with the words still in your mind and the fire still faintly warm and the people you loved breathing softly all around you. That question, at least, crosses the centuries without difficulty. And now, as we reach the end of this long journey through the medieval world, let us allow the day to finally, fully close. Let the cold fields go quiet. Let the fire settle into its last warmth. Let the village fall into the deep silence of a winter night, the bell distant and soft, the stars very bright and very far above the thatched roofs and the bare trees. You have traveled far tonight. You have walked the frozen morning paths and eaten the dense bread and felt the smoke in your eyes and heard the reeve read the obligations and watched the child in the field and held the wrapped hand after the healer's visit and looked up at the same indifferent, beautiful sky that has looked down on every version of human difficulty and human endurance that history contains. You have carried, for a few hours, the weight of a life that was harder than yours in almost every material respect, and perhaps found in that weight something unexpectedly familiar: the hunger for warmth, the need for community, the instinct to find meaning in the structure of the day, the way even the smallest pleasure arrives with disproportionate grace when everything around it is difficult. Let that go now. Let the medieval world recede, gently, like a landscape seen from a slowly moving boat, still visible, softening at the edges, becoming quieter, becoming still. The cold is not your cold. The darkness is not your darkness. You are here, wherever here is for you tonight, and here is warm, and here is safe, and here the night outside your window is the soft ambient dark of a world that will still be there in the morning, unchanged and waiting, full of everything you have not yet done and not yet seen and not yet understood. The straw pallet has become your bed, which is softer than anyone in the medieval world would quite believe. The rushlight has become the small glow of whatever device brought you here tonight, and you can let that go too now. Let it go dark. Let the screen dim and the words dissolve. The medieval peasant on their pallet in their smoky room, with their animals and their family and their obligations and their faith and their small private collection of joys and fears and hopes, closed their eyes on a world they had not chosen and could not change and found, in the closing, something that looked very much like peace. You can find it too. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. The night is long and quiet and entirely yours. Sweet dreams.